Thank you very much. So Paul Milgram has shown us how we can run quite sophisticated auctions to solve very complex new problems. He is the world leader in that, absolutely the world leader. So I'm going to try and do something a lot simpler. I'm going to argue that many existing operations can be greatly improved by auctioning multiple different kinds of things all at once in a single auction, rather than a set of separate auctions. And I mean, that's a version of what Paul has been doing, but I'm going to talk about it in a much simpler setting. And I'm going to show you specifically how the Bank of England improved its operations. But I hope you'll agree that it's all very straightforward stuff, and that we can do very simple things in the same way in the future in other potential applications. But I will begin with where I began helping the Bank of England. So we got the global financial crisis first in the UK. We got about a year before anybody else. We had a bank run, and I don't expect you guys in Ukraine get excited about one bank run that we had, because I know that you've had many more problems. But this was actually the first bank run we'd had in the UK for 140 years. So this wasn't just a small economic crisis in the UK, this was actually a big political crisis in the UK. There were queues around the block, and this was something everyone was focused on. So there was a bank run, there were other banks that seemed unstable. The Bank of England urgently wanted to get money out to commercial banks, building societies, etc., that needed money. And so what was the issue here? The issue was that prior to this time, if you wanted to borrow money from the Bank of England, then you had to give the Bank of England something in return. You had to give them collateral. You had to give, and the Bank of England would keep that something until you repaid your debts to it. So in the same way, if you borrow money from an ordinary bank to buy your house, you will have a mortgage, but the bank will own your house or part of your house until you pay that back. And so the central bank would lend money to commercial banks, provided the commercial banks gave collateral, which used to have to be so-called strong collateral, that is UK government bonds, US government bonds, something that was pretty trustworthy, had to be given in return. At the beginning of the financial crisis, we in the UK and people elsewhere, and I know that in Ukraine you've had these problems, banks didn't always have such high-quality collateral to give in return for funding. The Bank of England nevertheless wanted to support these banks, and so it was going to have to accept inferior collateral in return. So it said it would indeed accept these so-called toxic assets, mortgage-backed securities, etc., in return, provided that the people who gave inferior collateral paid higher interest rates. So the question was, for the Bank of England, who should it lend money to? What interest rate should it charge different people? And what kinds of collateral should each of the people who are borrowing money give the central bank? So I got a call from the governor of the Bank of England, and I, of course, then called my friends, in particular Jeremy Bulow, who's sitting here in the front row, was very helpful in giving me his advice. And so I'm going to talk to you, first of all, about what I did for the Bank of England with help, and secondly, well, I hope you'll see that the principles should be applicable far more generally, both within the financial sector and indeed outside. And I'll talk about a few other applications. So, the Bank of England, or many others, want to buy or sell many types of objects. In the case of the Bank of England, they want to sell many types of loans in return for prices, and the prices here are interest rates. And they want to do it in a single auction. Why do they want to do it in a single auction? Several reasons for that. Perhaps we can take a more mundane example. maybe you guys at the end of this talk would like a piece of fruit for tea. You might want an apple or you might want a banana. You might all like apples better than bananas. But if the price of an apple is much higher than the price of a banana, you'd rather have a banana. So you would like to know what the prices of apples and bananas are going to be before you buy. If we have one auction for apples and one auction for bananas, you have to choose which one to go to. You don't know which one to go to. You don't know which one's going to be better value for you. You would like to know in advance which auction is going to be better value for you. If we can run a single grand auction for both apples and bananas and find a way in which you can tell us for which prices you'd like apples and which prices you'd like bananas, that will be better for you. If I'm the grocer with apples and bananas to sell, it will be better for me too, because if I have two separate auctions, I've got to figure out how many apples to sell and how many bananas to sell. I would like to know something about demand before I make that decision. And if I run a single grand auction, then I can decide, after looking at all the bids, what to do. And the third reason for running a single grand auction is that it makes the market more competitive. It means the people bidding for apples are competing with the people bidding for bananas and the people who might want apples or bananas. And the more you have different bidders competing with each other, the better things are going to work, especially for the auctioneer. Now, as I say, the central bank, however, had always auctioned a single type of loan at a time. Indeed, more generally, it auctioned a single type of asset at a time. And so, well, the central bank, the British central bank in this particular context, for the three reasons I've given, wanted a single grand auction. And they're the three reasons I was given: reduce market power, in other words, have more competition, allow bidders to express their preferences about what they want in a more sophisticated way than just saying, I either want an apple or a banana, and allowing the central bank to decide not that it was going to give out a given amount of money against good collateral and a given amount of money against bad collateral, but instead to let the amount of money it gives out against inferior collateral to depend upon the interest rate difference between good and bad. It didn't really want to accept any bad collateral. It had never done that in the past. It felt it had to accept bad collateral. If it was going to accept bad collateral, it would want a higher price. If it was forced to accept a lot of bad collateral, it wanted a very much higher price difference between good and bad. So that's, the example which I actually worked on for the Bank of England. But there are many other examples where the same issues arise. So an obvious one would be the sale of government debt. So if you've got different government bonds you want to sell, you'll do better if you sell them in a single grand auction than separately. And I know, in fact, that here in Ukraine you actually do, if you're selling government bonds, sell them in a single auction. I believe you do, and that's great. The things that this auction that I'll talk about can do go a little bit further than what you do in Ukraine. First of all, the way you do it in Ukraine, I believe, is that you get bids on the different bonds, and then the Minister of Finance looks at all the bids and decides how much to sell of each. So that's a slightly ad hoc process, and it's not quite clear what principles the Minister of Finance is using, and possibly they could be challenged about what principles he's using. And so we're going to talk about a more scientific way of deciding, a way of deciding in advance what you're going to do, which you don't have to follow, but if you want a defensible way of defending what you've done, you can follow if you wish. And also, we're going to give the bidders the ability to express their preferences about what they want. So they can say, I'd rather have these bonds rather than those bonds if I don't have to pay more than 6 basis points more for these than those, or something like that. So government bonds is one natural application. I helped the government of Iceland when they were thinking about buying back offshore bank accounts. Another example that hasn't actually happened yet, but the UK government is worried about energy capacity, and it wants to buy different kinds of energy capacity. It wants alternative energies. It also has carbon reduction targets. So, I mean, wind is good, but it can't have just wind because the wind isn't always blowing. So you also got gas, nuclear, tidal, etc., etc. I know you have similar issues in Ukraine that you want to, you want to run auctions for energy capacity, and there's a question of how you should do that. So what you traditionally do is you have a negotiation with someone who might build you a nuclear power plant, and then quite separately you have a negotiation for someone who might build you some gas plants and maybe run an auction for wind power. But these are all separate things. It would be much better if you could do it all in one go, and then you could compare your bids on wind with your bids on gas and your bids on nuclear, and think about the constraints you have and the different objectives you have about your carbon targets, etc., and work out what was best on the basis of all the bidding at once. So those are a few examples. And then take a really important issue, at least from my point of view, when my local student union wanted to sell its second-hand exercise machines. It had the same issue. It had a variety of different used exercise machines, and there'd be people who might want one machine or another machine, but that, typically a student can only afford to buy one machine, even second-hand, and you might say, well, I'll rather have this machine, but if the other machine is much cheaper, I'll have the other machine. And so, in fact, they came to me and they decided to run this kind of auction for exercise machines, and it worked very nicely. So that's another potential application of these kinds of auctions. Okay, so these auctions that I first designed for the Bank of England, general problem is selling multiple varieties of a product, the costs of selling the product, your preferences about how much you'll sell of the different kinds of product depend on the mix of varieties you're selling, or conversely, you're buying, you're procuring different kinds of products, and the general solution then is what I call a product mix auction. So we're going to do this all in one quick single auction. Of course, economists have run auctions for multiple varieties of multiple products before. Paul Milgram has given you the latest on that. And in particular, if you run multi-stage auctions, then you can do lots of clever stuff. And so, for example, I have also run multi-stage auctions. 20 years ago, I ran an auction for the UK, which made them very happy because it raised 2.5% of GDP in a single auction. And in fact, I used design that had been pioneered by Paul Milgram and his co-authors. And, these can work extremely well. But they don't always work extremely well. There are a variety of reasons why there can be problems. Perhaps the one, and I've listed them there, but perhaps the one that's most salient is they typically take a long time, or they can take a long time. So the one that Paul just told you about took many months. The one that I ran here took 7 weeks. If you're dealing with bank runs, you don't have 7 weeks. If you're dealing with a bank run and people queuing around the block, you have closer to 7 seconds. So we wanted to run an auction that was going to take 7 seconds. So the question is how we were going to do that. And so I invented something I called a product mix auction for the Bank of England. And I'm now going to show you how that works. And then we can talk about other applications and other variants of what the Bank of England did. So we actually have some software for this, which generates very pretty pictures, which actually have better colors on the screen than something curious happening here, but never mind. And it's all free, so just let me know if you'd like to look at it. And I'm going to show you how this works. And so that's actually just an input slide. So let us start with a really simple example, because then I'll illustrate the point of these kinds of auctions. So a really simple example would be if I have just an auction for a single variety of a product. And so people will input their bids for this single product. And I've got just 4 bidders here. And the first one has bid a price of 18 for 4 units. But that first bidder is also saying that if he would take another 8 units at a price of 12, and a further 5 units if the price was all the way down to 8. And then I've got 3 more bidders, each of whom had just made a single bid for some number of units at up to a single price. So it's just a set of bids for quantities of apples, shall we say. And in this little example, I have an auctioneer who is selling 30 apples, and I've got a reserve price of 0, so prepared to sell at any price down to 0 if we absolutely have to. So there's absolutely the simplest kind of auction, although I have got multiple units to sell at the same time. But it's just a single variety. So I can run my little software, and it will show you the winning bids. And in this case, the person who bid a very high price of 4 units is surely a winner. That person also bid for 8 units at a lower price and will win those 8 units as well. The third bid that person made, here is our auction, and we've already established this guy's going to win 4 units there, another 8 units, because we're going to take the top 30 units bid for. His third bid, however, was not high enough price, so there's no full circle there. This guy bid for 11 units and will win all 11. This guy actually bid for 15 units, but 15 plus 11 plus 8 plus 4 is too many, given I'm only selling 30, so he'll only win 7 units. And that will exhaust the 30 I've got to sell. And so those are the number of units I'll allocate in this auction. And then there's the question of how we price those units. And there are 2 basic ways in which we can price in an auction. I mean, there are other sophisticated ways, but most auctions in the world are one or other of 2 basic ways. Either you charge everyone the actual price they bid, and so in this case, the guy who won 4 at 18 pays 18. He then pays another 12 per unit for the next 8, 10 per unit for the next 11. That's a different bidder, a different color. And this guy here pays 9 per unit for the 7 that he does get to win. And that exhausts it. So that's one way of doing the pricing. There's a second standard way of doing pricing, and that is uniform pricing. And that is that we charge the same price to everyone who's a winner. So what we do is we simply find the price that is just enough that everyone who is a winner is willing to pay it. But those who are not winners are not willing to pay it. So in this case, the price we find is, of course, 9. And 9 is the price that will be paid by all these people, whatever their actual bids were. Okay, that is a uniform price auction. And I'm going to emphasize that. We don't have to run things that way, but that has some nice properties, as we will now describe. The first nice property is that anyone who bids their actual valuation, the actual amount they value the object they're bidding for, will get exactly what they would have chosen if they knew the auction price in advance. So the auction price turns out to be 9. And so these guys, this guy bid 18 for 4, 12 for 8, and he would surely want to win those at 9. If he knew the price was going to be 9, if his valuation on these last 5 was really 8, which is the bid he made, then he wouldn't want to win these last 5. So you get in this auction exactly what you would have chosen at the prices, auction price, if you bid your actual valuations. And relatedly, bidders do best to bid close to their actual valuations. Honest bidding is essentially the best policy here. Why is that? Well, who can gain by not bidding their actual valuations? If the guy who's colored in blue had deviated with these bids. If he had lowered this bid a bit, it would have made no difference to the final price, because it's still going to be 9. He can only change the final price if he lowers his bid so far that he isn't actually a winner anymore. Likewise, this bid of 8 and this bid of 5 that was below the final auction price, he can only make it a winner by going to the point where the price is actually, he pays more than he actually values the thing for. So he doesn't want to change his bids. And you can check that no one wants to change their bids, with the exception of the guy who is marginal, who might do better, and indeed in this case can do better, by lowering his bid a little bit. Because he's the marginal guy, the price has been set by him. The final price was really determined by him. If he had lowered his bid, he would have changed that price, and that would have benefited him a bit. So it's not true that, it's not strictly true that you should always, it always turns out that if you bid your actual values, then that was the best thing for you, but it is almost true. Typically, only the rational bidder can gain from not saying exactly what his or her actual value is. And because of that, I mean, why do we care about that? The next thing I should say is not only is all that true, but it is obviously true. So this relates a bit to what Paul was saying earlier. It's pretty clear to bidders that this will be the case. Certainly, I can persuade bidders quite easily that this will be the case with a little bit of discussion, and so they will likely be willing to bid their actual values. In fact, this was an example where there were only 4 bidders, and so this was a case where it was less true than usual. The more bidders we have, the less likely any one bidder is going to be the marginal bidder who sets the price, and so the less likely any one bidder can gain by deviation. So if you have a reasonable number of bidders here, bidders just do best to say their actual values, to bid their actual values. And the reasons why I care about that is threefold. First of all, if people actually say their actual values, bid their actual values, then the people with the highest actual values will be the winners. And that is socially desirable, usually, that the people with the highest value for an object win the object. Secondly, it can provide good information to the auctioneer. So in the case of the Bank of England, they were concerned to know how desperate people were to use their inferior collateral. And here you actually see how desperate people are. And thirdly, and also I think perhaps particularly important, it makes it easy for people to bid in a sensible way. If the sensible way of bidding is simply to state your value, then it is very easy to bid. The Bank of England did not wish to have to give seminars on how to optimally bid in auctions in the middle of a financial crisis. It wanted people who had never participated in these auctions before to be able to enter, and enter quickly, easily, and comfortably. So the auction that I designed for the Bank of England will maintain all those properties which we thought were important. So this is a simple so-called uniform price auction. And one nice way of thinking about it would just be to think about it as like an ordinary market. I mean, what I've drawn here is the set of, I have to improve my slide usage. So we had the high bid for a few units, and then we have a series of steps showing the different bids. This is just a market, really, in which the auctioneer has a supply of 30, and the bidders together form a demand curve showing how much you can sell at different prices. And all the uniform price auction is doing is replicating a competitive market, or doing its best to replicate a competitive market, which is a nice feature of it. So we can now turn to worrying about selling different kinds of objects. And so if we have 2 kinds of objects, one thing we can do is simply run 2 separate auctions. And so, for example, the US Federal Reserve faced a similar problem to the Bank of England a little bit later, and they simply ran separate auctions for strong and weak collateral in different weeks. And if you have many different products, you could just run many different auctions. And so I've just given you 2 different examples of 2 auctions for 30 units, and one of them clears at a price of 9 and the other clears at a price of 15. And, you know, that may be okay, but maybe that isn't optimal for the reasons that I described. So what you can do instead, the next simple thing you might think of doing would simply be to combine the 2 auctions. And if you combine the 2 auctions and treated the 2 varieties as identical, so if I was the grocer again, I'd just be saying I'm selling pieces of fruit. I've got 60 pieces of fruit, and the 60 winners could then choose at the end whether they want apples or bananas. But I'm going to treat them all as being the same thing. And so running that auction, then what we've got is a demand curve for apples, a demand curve for oranges, and the auction will actually look at adding the 2 demand curves together, saying I'll sell up to 60 in all, and that will set the price, price at 13, because at a price of 13 I can sell 60 pieces of fruit. In this case, 49 of type 2 and 11 of type 1. So that combines the 2 auctions. I can represent this graphically. So previously, I just ran an auction for 1 good, and I had a price of 15 on 1 good, and on the other good, I had a price which was 9, I think. By running the 2 auctions and treating them as a single good, and saying I'm indifferent about which ones I sell, and I'm just going to get the best price I can on the 60, treating them as identical, I will end up with a price of 13 on both goods. I will accept more bids on good 2 than before, fewer bids correspondingly on good 1 than before. So the price will go, if I'm accepting more bids on good 2, the price will go down on good 2, up on good 1. And, well, we get different quantities being sold. The prices come together, but I'm now selling the same total quantity. And actually, the Bank of England did something like that before consulting me. The European Central Bank's done things like that too. And that may be fine. The auctioneer may be indifferent about whether he's selling apples or oranges. He may not care. But sometimes you do care. And if you're accepting good and bad collateral, you do actually care. You do actually say, I'd rather accept good collateral than bad collateral, and simply saying I'm treated all as the same is obviously not satisfactory, because you would rather not, you'd accept a lower price from someone if they're prepared to give you the good rather than the bad. So simply saying that they can give whichever they like isn't good enough. So you can do a variety of things. I've shown you a couple of things. This one, okay, we combined the 2 auctions. We sold at price of 13 on both goods. The other first option we looked at was we had 2 separate auctions. We still sold 60 in total, but in that one we insisted it was going to be 30 on each item, and so the prices are 9 and 15. But those aren't the only options. We can find other options that sell 60 in total. So we could choose an even lower price on good 1 and an even higher price on good 2. And that would sell even more on good 1, even less on good 2, but still sell 60 in all. And so I've got 3 different price vectors, which all sell 60 units by selling different shares of the 2 goods. Or I can find even more. So obviously I've got a list of possibilities that, in principle, I could choose between. So this is a bit like the problem of the Minister of Finance, who's selling 2 different bonds, and he can charge different interest rates on the 2 bonds. There are a number of ways he can do it to sell the right amount of bonds in total. How's he going to choose? Or in the case of the Bank of England, how is the Bank of England going to choose? Well, one thing I can do is show them a picture like that and say, choose on that picture which of those points you like. And, well, it was immediately clear to both me and them this wasn't what they wanted to do, because they don't really understand that picture very well. It's not clear to them which is the best point on that picture. And the reason is that they want the price difference to be a function of the amount of one type, the percentage of good 1 that's sold and the percentage of good 2 that's sold. And this picture doesn't show that directly. This picture shows you the prices, and then you've got to think about how much of the 2 goods is sold, and it's not immediately obvious which of these points you like. But all the information is in that picture, because any asterisk I choose shows me the prices directly, and therefore shows me the price difference between the 2 goods. And furthermore, any asterisk I choose, I can see which bids are accepted and which are rejected, and I can count them up. So the ones at the top are accepted on good 2, the ones to the right are accepted on good 1, the ones in the blue rectangle are rejected, so I can simply add them all up. So I can get the information I want from the picture and go from that picture to one that is more useful to the Bank of England, which is this picture. So each of the 5 asterisks, I can work out what the total amount of good 2 I'm selling is, and correspondingly of good 1, and also the price difference between the goods. And I can actually work it out. So I basically can generate, I've given you the 5 points, but I also my software just generates quickly all the other points and shows you the relative demand, in effect. And so now the Bank of England could, if it wished, simply choose any point. And so one option we've talked about is treating the 2 varieties identical, so the price difference is therefore 0 if you treat them as identical. And that sells 49 of good 2 and 0 of, and a price difference of 0, and therefore 11 of good 1, 60 minus 49 of good 1. Or you might say, well, okay, I know that I want a price that's higher by 8 on good 2 rather than on good 1. And that, in fact, corresponds to something that some central banks have done, a so-called reference price auction. You say that we're going to sell all the varieties simultaneously. There'll be a pre-specified price ratio, price difference. So the Bank of Japan, Reserve Bank of Australia, the US Fed have done things like that. And that can actually work quite well if you know what the right price difference is. But you have to know what the right price difference is, and you may not. The auctioneer may not have the information to set the right price difference. It may not want to say to people what it thinks the right price difference is. The Bank of England was quite clear it did not want to suggest to the market what the right price difference between bad and good collateral was, because it didn't want to sort of suggest to the market that the financial crisis was worse today than yesterday, for example, by suggesting a bigger price difference. More generally, central banks often don't want to feel they're leading the market. I was talking to people in your central bank, and your people, some of them here, told me that, at least in some of your operations, you do not wish to lead the market. You want the market to be telling you what the prices are, rather than you specifying the prices to the market. And of course, you may want to learn something from people's valuations. So the Bank of England was quite clear it wanted to let the market determine the price differences, to let the auction determine the price differences based on demand. So, well, something else you could do is you could constrain the maximum quantity of, this bad collateral you're prepared to allocate. But what the Bank of England did, and I'm not saying anything, there's an obvious solution really. You just say in advance how much you care about the price, about, having to allocate bad collateral versus good collateral as a function of the price difference between bad and good. And so you simply specify in advance that you will accept, a little bit of bad collateral even for no price difference in this example, and then the higher the price difference is, the higher the interest rate difference that is, the more bad collateral you're willing to accept. And you just look at the intersection between your supply curve and the market's demand curve. I mean, the red points, remember, are nothing to do with the Bank of England. They have purely been generated by the bidding information. So the bank sets the blue, and the red comes in. It's just a function of the bids. And so the bank can produce pictures like that. It then also has pictures like this, which show what the actual allocation will be and which bids are allocated, who on good 1 and on good 2, who gets what. The circles that are colored in that are filled, the circles that are not colored in are not filled. The marginal bids are the ones that set the prices and may be rationed. So the next slide is essentially a screenshot from the Bank of England's auction. The bank still runs this auction every month, at least every month, sometimes more often. If you go into the Bank of England on a Tuesday in the middle of the month at 10:30 in the morning, what you would see is the blue line on the screen. And then, actually, sorry, it's about 10 o'clock in the morning, you'll see the blue line on the screen. And then from 10 to 10:30, but mostly very close to 10:30, the bids come in and the red dots are created, and the intersection is shown, and that tells you the price difference. And from the price difference, you can go back and work out what the allocation is to the two goods. And so the top might be a standard auction, and the lower one might be when things are more stressed. So, for example, you will all know that what we regarded as a rather serious event, we had a referendum on leaving Europe, and rather to the market's surprise, the population voted to leave Europe, and that was a shock, and the Bank of England therefore immediately ran one of these auctions. The bankers were more concerned, the demand was, people were more stressed, people were prepared to bid more to give bad collateral in return for funds. So this red curve shifted up a bit, and the result was that you can see that more money was given out against bad collateral, more loans were given out against bad collateral, and the price difference responded at the same time within the auction. Screenshots in inverted commas for a couple of reasons. First of all, the Bank of England now does things more complicated than that, or the pictures are more complicated. Secondly, the Bank of England prefers not to reveal the blue line, and so that's not public information. It doesn't look exactly like that. But that is fundamentally what is going on. And I think it's fair to say it turned the governor of the Bank of England from looking something like that to something a little happier. And I think he really was a lot happier. You see, these guys, you know, they're all trained in economics. They've all been trained about how great competitive equilibrium is, all the nice property that equilibrium has. And fundamentally, all this auction is doing is finding competitive equilibrium. All we're doing is, I mean, an auction is just an artificial market. I mean, the reason that people like, you know, auction designers like us got involved a lot in the financial crisis was because the markets were sort of seizing up. People didn't know who they wanted to trade with. And when the real markets fail, sorry, the standard markets fail, then what you do is you create an artificial market. An auction does an artificial market. And this is an artificial market that is trying to find, and indeed finding, the competitive equilibrium. And so, in fact, I wasn't there, unfortunately, but I'm told that at the Christmas lunch that year for his staff, he talked about how great it was that, you know, auction designers could do this so that on the computer screens in the Bank of England, you could actually artificially find the competitive equilibrium in these markets. So that made him very happy. So I've shown you roughly how it was done I've shown you exactly how it was done initially in the earlier stages of the financial crisis. You could use the same auction, for example, to discriminate between bonds of different maturities. My suggestion might be, if you've never done that in the past, that you start off not changing things very much, so that would correspond to a very steep supply curve, which says basically you're almost always going to allocate roughly the same amount. Roughly a fixed amount to good one, and sorry, there's a good two, and the corresponding amount to good one. But if if the demand changes a lot, then you will change the amount you allocate. There's one more feature, actually, that I haven't emphasized yet, which was in the Bank of England's auction. I talked at the beginning about bidders who might also have preferences between the two goods and don't just want to bid on apples only or on bananas only. So what, for example, if a bidder can substitute between the two goods And in an auction of bonds, you might say, I prefer maturity 2 if the price difference is less than or equal to 4 basis points, but maturity number 1 otherwise. Or in the Bank of England's auction, you'll say, you do actually have available both strong and weak collateral, and you want to use whatever's better priced, where better price is something you define. And so for that, we allow the bidders an extra option, which is not just to bid on single goods. Is that my next slide? Well, let me show you the extra option first of all. So this is what I call a paired bid. And so an ordinary bid is like this one, which is for 11 units at a price of up to 17, or for 11 units at a different on the other good at a price up to 15. But a paired bid would be something like, I want 2 pieces of fruit, and I'll pay up to 13 on apples and up to 17 on bananas. And so if I go back to my picture, the paired bid I can represent in my 2-dimensional picture like this, because this point has the coordinates 13 on good 1, 17 on good 2. And this is one reason I've drawn my pictures in 2 dimensions, because you can see that this bid actually falls below the diagonal line, which is actually showing that good 1 is better value. So in the equilibrium of this auction, the software is telling me that the best prices are, the efficient prices are 14 on good 2 and 9 on good 1. The bidder's valuation, if he bid his actual values, were 13 on good 1 and 17 on good 2. So which piece of fruit does he want? Well, on good 2, his value is 17 and the price was 14, so you think of him as having a benefit of 3. On good 1, he bid at 13, the price is 9, so think of him as having a benefit of 4, so he actually prefers good 1 to good 2, and so the auction will give him good 1 and charge him the price of good 1. So this is the way in which bidders can express their preferences about which goods they want. That's the last thing that I was saying this auction can do if you wish it to. So that's really how the auction works. All we are really doing, you don't have to make these bids if you don't want to. If you don't want to make these bids, you can just make ordinary bids on either apples or on bananas, or you can make many bids on apples or many bids on bananas or both. This is an option that's available to bidders if they wish to use it. So what we've done then is we have, in effect, added standard auctions so that the auctioneer can better express its preferences and do so in a clear fashion. And we've also allowed these either-or bids, which allow a bidder to express their preferences better. And so that's basically what the auction did. And so now I can show you give you an advertising break. Nice quote from Mervyn King, the Government Bank of England, the economist. Nice quote from the executive director who was in charge of this part of the bank at the time, both saying how great this was. So I hope that you can see that doing this kind of thing can be helpful. In fact, I'll give you even another bit of advertising. Because in some ways, the acid test was that when we had a new governor of the Bank of England, who wasn't the one who had commissioned this kind of work, he thought it was a good idea as well. And he said, this is great, so let's do more of this stuff, and actually let's do something that's a bit more sophisticated. And I deliberately started with something that's really simple. And we actually started with just 2 dimensions, just 2 classes of collateral, so that we could draw 2-dimensional graphs and we could show everybody exactly how it was working. But really, of course, you want to have many varieties of collateral. You will be selling many varieties of bonds at the same time, and so you want to be able to extend to many different goods. And you may want more sophisticated ways of expressing your preferences. So in fact, they were particularly concerned with the Bank of England expressing its preferences in a richer way. And so prior to 2014, we had always had we'd always pre-specified how much money we were going to allocate in loans. It was either 2.5 billion or 5 billion, depending on the auction. But when the new governor came in, he said, well, that's not good enough, because I might want the total amount of money I give out to depend upon the bidding as well. And I might have a way of expressing my preferences about that. So together with my then student and now a faculty member, Elizabeth Baldwin, we extended our auction to allow that as well. And so now, if you were to look at the bank's pictures, you would see two graphs, because we have an extra degree of freedom for the bank, and therefore it has to express its preferences in a more sophisticated way with an extra two-dimensional function. And at the same time, we also extend to more goods. And so I think you can do up to 10 goods easily in the software on the web app, and more goods if you want to in a command line implementation. And that's a picture with 3 goods. And we have 3-dimensional pictures, which we probably don't need to spend time on now. And we've done other things with the Bank of England as well. So, for example, they wanted to buy corporate bonds a couple of years ago in their quantitative easing. And so they were buying bonds from different companies. And the point is that depending on the application, you want to express your preferences in different ways. So for purchases of well, let's go to the case that I discussed so far. If you're discussing loans, then you probably think of loans against bad collateral as clearly more valuable to the bidders than loans against good collateral. Everyone agrees they should be more expensive. If you're talking about Shell and BP, it may not be, or bonds of different maturities, it may not be obvious which should be the higher price. So it's natural to think of goods in a more horizontal, symmetric way, rather than in a vertically differentiated way. And so for that purpose, we actually allow people to express their preferences in a different way. So whereas for the loans, they express their preferences as how much they allocate a good to as a function of the price difference, for bonds, we think of how much of good 1 as a function of the price of that good, and how much good 2 as a price of that good, and a constraint over the total of the 2 goods together. Iceland had a different problem. Iceland had blocked the assets of people, because they had the financial crisis even worse than we did, and they wanted to get out of capital controls and to swap these offshore accounts in return for one of a number of different assets that either be Icelandic krona, bonds in Icelandic krona, or bonds in euros or cash. And so a crucial aspect of this auction was that each bidder would have a fixed budget, a fixed amount of money in her account. I mean, you've got a blocked account, that's exactly the amount of money you can spend, no more than that. And so that budget constraint was really important. And so in this case, we let the bidders express their preferences in a different way. Whereas in the Bank of England, you'd say how many pieces of fruit you wanted to buy, and for some maximum price on apple and some maximum price on bananas. Here you would say, how much of my money or my blocked asset do I want to spend? What budget do I want to spend? And how much I'm prepared to pay for this bond, how much I'm prepared to pay for that bond per unit. So it's a different way of expressing our preferences. I should say at this point that this was a rather sad application, because they decided they want to use a product mix auction based on having read my papers. They announced they would do that. They made various announcements. They asked me for some pro bono advice, which I gave them, but they paid some other consultants to actually program this up. They promised the rules would be published in detail in April 2016. And then roughly on the 3rd of April 2016, the Panama Papers were leaked and revealed the Prime Minister's wife had a lot of offshore funds. And it no longer seemed politically optimal to have a rather novel kind of auction, something a little bit different from usual, to buy back these offshore accounts when you just discovered the Prime Minister's wife has a lot of offshore funds, and a few days later it turned out the President's wife also had offshore funds, and so this didn't actually happen. But never mind. This is actually in the software that's available to you if you want. Okay, we don't have to go into this in detail, but with budget constraints, the way your preferences will work is going to be a little bit different. The auctioneer's objectives were a bit different as well. The Icelandic government wanted to minimize its costs, whereas the Bank of England was concerned with social efficiency. maximizing the sum of, in some sense, of bidders' welfare and its welfare. We can also run our programs to maximize profits. We can do lots of other things as well. We can also have alternative pricing rules. So we can do discriminatory pay or bid pricing. I'm not quite as keen on that because it doesn't have the properties anymore that we will have as efficient allocation probably, or as informative bidding, or as easy bidding, but it's all our programs can allow that, and we can use these auctions in that way too. So I hope I've given you some sense as to how these things work. I'm just going to do 5 minutes for the academics in the audience to show you a little bit of underlying theory, which none of the practitioners need to think about if they don't want to. But I've been a little bit loose, first of all, about what I'm doing. We can also have people who are both buyers and sellers, if you wish as well. But let's not worry about that now. So this auction is one in, how do I define this auction? It's one in which you simultaneously have bidders stating their preferences, and at the same time, and there are alternative ways in which they can express their preference depending on the context, and we then implement a competitive equilibrium allocation consistent with those stated preferences. The basic version will have lowest competitive equilibrium prices, but we can do pay or bid pricing as well. And I've done some work on the efficiency of that, but it's not as efficient. The auction will work well if bidders express approximately their true values. The auctioneer certainly need not express his or her actual preferences in this auction. The Bank of England was clear that it would. The Icelandic government was clear that it would actually try to maximize its own welfare, but it would do so in such a way that would mimic, it would distort its supply function, but that isn't going to affect, if you've got enough bidders, the fact that bidders will still do best to tell the truth. Bidders will still do best to bid their actual valuations. So when I say tell the truth, I just mean do your bids express your actual preferences. Everyone follows the rules in these auctions, and we insist on a precise set of rules that are followed, and that's open and transparent. The question, of course, is whether when you make a bid, your bid actually reveals your true value. So it will still be true in something like the Icelandic case that the bidders will do best to reveal their true values. A key feature of my auction is that bids can be understood geometrically. They can be explained to people, if you wish, geometrically. That's not, of course, how bidders input them as geometric pictures. And we can analyze them geometrically. And this geometric language is easy for bidders to understand and use, and for bidders to be able to express their preferences accurately in. We have to make sure that the auctioneer, of course, understands it and trusts it. And it turns out this geometric way of representing things can be very helpful. I mean, I had to explain this to the governor of the Bank of England in the amount of time that he was prepared to give me. He came actually to Oxford and sat in my office, but I knew I had sort of 15 or 20 minutes to be fairly compelling that this auction was going to work, and that he could be confident this auction would actually find the outcome that he wanted correctly, unambiguously correctly. And this geometric language, this geometric way of thinking about it, was important for that. There are other ways of showing language, doing these things, but this is the way that we're doing, and this is the way that, turns out to have been effective in actually getting people to apply the ideas. It's no good having some brilliant theory if no one understands it well enough to be willing to apply it. Geometry, and so this is for the academics, because no one else needs to worry about the geometry they don't want to. So in the simplest case, with just two kinds of auction, the geometry is really easy. So this would be a bid that I'm prepared to pay 60 pence for an apple, and I do not want a banana at all, so my willingness to pay for a banana is 0. I could make a more sophisticated bid. This one says I'm prepared to pay 60 pence for an apple and 50 pence for a banana. So if prices are really high, I want nothing. If prices are high on apples and low on bananas, I want a banana. If they are low on bananas and high on if they're high on bananas and low on apples, I want an apple. And it's kind of ambiguous down here, because you're prepared to pay both the 50 for the apple and the 60 the 50 for the banana and the 60 for the apple, if the prices the auction sets are in this region. But if we assume the bid means that you would prefer the apple to the banana if the price difference is less than 10 pence, which is a natural assumption, then that corresponds to a diagonal line which divides up the space. And so this is a bid which shows my preference. I have a slight preference for apples over bananas. But my wife has a strong preference for apples over bananas, so this is the bid she might make. Or if I want to bid for her and myself, then I just make both these two bids. And depending on the prices the auction sets, it will either give me one apple or one banana, or if prices are extreme, two pieces of fruit of the same kind, or potentially nothing. So what do the bids show? Well, this was my bid, showing how I would divide up what I want as a function, apple, banana, or nothing. This shows that she wants apple, banana, or nothing in this region. So we simply superimpose the two bids, and that gives us the combined preferences that if prices are really high on apples and low on bananas, we will both have bananas. At the other extreme, both apples. In the middle range, it's an apple for one of us and a banana for one of us. So it's a very nice way of seeing how our preferences, the preference of my family as a function of the prices. Aggregating bids is now elementary from the auctioneer's point of view. It doesn't matter whether a bid is a bid made by the, a set of bids is made by one bidder or by many bidders. And the auctioneer can just take all the bids and work out what's best for it in exactly the same way as I described before, and generate an auction solution just in the same way as I described before. So the point of all these things is what we're doing is we're developing a bidding language. And as I say, I'm not the first person to talk about bidding languages by any means. What I'm doing here is giving different people languages to express their preferences in ways that are natural for them. So I've given the bidders these dot bid languages. I've given the auctioneer these blue graphs to express their supply preferences. It looks rather different. In fact, they're the same in the sense that they can express the same sets of preferences. I mean, it's not surprising in a way because the picture is actually symmetric, you can see, between the demand curve and the supply curve. So I could equally well have the Bank of England express its preferences in dot bids, and that would work just fine as well. The important thing is that each participant should have a language that is natural for it. And then, given the languages, we can talk about well, what preferences can you express with these different languages. So, can the bidder express preferences like that with these languages? These express one-to-one trade-offs, so the people in the front row will be familiar with pictures like that. Can we express those preferences? Well, with simple dot bids, you actually have a problem, because you can't actually easily get this kind of meat. That's the place that causes a problem. So what can you do if you want to express those preferences? You can try and express them. I mean, you might start with a dot bid there and put another dot bid in. And you can see I'm kind of building out the map I want. I've done pretty well with 3 dot bids, but I've actually got 3 extra lines there that I didn't really want. So what I can do is put in a negative bid now, and the negative bid will cancel out. You can see exactly the 3 bits of line that I didn't want. So with 3 ordinary dot bids for positive amounts of money and 1 negative bid, a cancellation bid for a negative amount, I can generate exactly the preferences that I was trying to represent. And so an economics talk has to have at least one theorem. Mine doesn't have many as Paul's did, but I've got at least one for you. And so theorem is that if you have one-to-one trade-offs everywhere, strong substitute preferences, so-called, we can perfectly represent our preferences using a set of positive and negative dot bids. In fact, we're better than that. This is an if and only if theorem, which says that we, any valid set of, that's actually, I mean, the good and bad news is that any set of dot bids, positive and negative, that express valid preferences, must express strong substitute preferences. So those are one-to-one trade-offs. And those were natural for the Bank of England, because the Bank of England is in a situation where people say, I want £100 million, and I might give you strong collateral or weak collateral, but I want £100 million. And it's less likely for someone to say, I might want, well, I've said billions. I'm less likely to say I want a billion loan using type A collateral or a 2 billion loan using type B collateral. It's likely 1 billion versus 1 billion if I make one of these paired bids at all. And the preferences I've shown you basically restrict to the kind of bids at the top. So at the end of this exhausting seminar, you might want either a cup of tea or a cup of tea with milk, but you're not going to say either 1 cup of tea without milk or 2 cups of tea with milk, probably. But what if you did say 1 cup of tea without or 2 cups of tea with? Well, we can easily extend to that. The ordinary dot bids I showed you were like this. We can extend by saying we have dot bids which represent trade-offs now between multiple units of one good and a single unit of another, or multiple units versus multiple units, 2 apples versus 3 bananas. That represents different sets of preferences. So I actually do have a second theorem here after all. The second theorem is that, that was the first theorem. The second theorem is that I can actually express any substitute preferences using these generalized positive and negative dot bids. And I can go further still. Sorry, that. And the most recent update of the Bank of England's program actually allows some complement preferences as well. And then we can do similar things. So, for example, Iceland, we had the fixed budgets. Now, if your budget is fixed, that expresses a different kind of preferences. If your budget's fixed, that's like, I say you've got £5 only to spend, and you're going to the market, and you want whatever's best value for you, apples or bananas. But now what you're going to care about is not the difference between the price of apples and the price of bananas. You're going to care about the ratio of the prices. And so if you care about the ratio of prices, then you're going to divide up price space in a different way. So the map of preferences is going to be rather different. You see all the diagonal lines now will go through the origin. But again, we have the same properties that we can draw these maps. We can look at the aggregate of bids by superimposing the individual bidders. And we can proceed broadly as before. So we've got this family of geometric languages augmented with these simple supply functions. And that actually, I mean, the simpler ones are helpful in explaining to people how these auctions work. They're also helpful for us to use mathematical geometry to analyze things and check that in weird cases nothing's going to go wrong and show that we're robust against different kinds of manipulation. So it's useful for economic analysis as well. We won't talk about solving the auction today. We've got several different ways of solving these things. In summary, because I think I have actually used up, yes, I have used up my time. So in summary, we are having bidders simultaneously expressing their preferences as bids. There are alternative ways to express those depending on the context. And for the academics, the bids can be understood, explained, and analyzed geometrically. And I then implement an allocation consistent with bidders' stated preferences. And in the basic and with a competitive equilibrium, because I want an efficient outcome. And the basic version uses the lowest competitive equilibrium prices that are available. It's easy to start simple here. That's important. I'm not suggesting for a moment you should offer all these different languages to anyone. You should think about your particular context. Most likely what you should do is probably just, start off, if you're selling your government bonds, you just take bids as usual, in which the bidders are simply allowed to bid on, they can make a bid on a bond for this maturity, they can make another bid on a bond for that maturity, but nothing clever, no either-or bids to begin with. Later on, if people are happy with that and the bidders would like it, then you can allow them to do more sophisticated things. I'm not saying that you have to be rigidly ruled by any mechanism like this. You may find the way you want to use this is to develop your ideas, guess how you're going to allocate things as a function of the bids. When you get the bids in, you run the program, see what it's saying, but then say, is this really what I want to do? It may not be what you really want to do. I mean, you'll learn something from that you hadn't thought quite right about how you were, what your preferences really were. But you always have the ability to actually go back to doing something different if you want to. But it can suggest ideas for you. So that is basically it. And I've emphasized the Bank of England because that's what I spend a lot of time helping them in different ways. But it certainly has many other applications beyond finance. For example, this very important application of selling used gym equipment to students, and others too. And you know, I am aware that there are some problems in Ukraine, and I'm delighted to help. If I can offer any advice, I am delighted to offer advice to anyone here who thinks they can use it. So thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you. Are there any questions? Yes, please. I'll give you a mic.
The National Bank of Ukraine, we have such question. Here in Ukraine, you use auctions, reverse auctions, in order to buy goods, services of appropriate quality for the minimal price. We compare companies' proposals only by total cost of the proposals. But we know that private companies use best-in-class analysis. They compare proposals by each position, not by total cost. For example, if we buy stationery, we compare price for pen from one company and two company. Then we compare price for pencil and so on and so forth. So the question is the following. Does the National Bank of England have such experience of using of best-in-class analysis? Yes, thank you.
Okay, I don't think the Bank of England, to my knowledge, does not use this auction for buying pencils. Nor, in fact, does it use it for selling fruit. That was also an example. You certainly could use this auction for that kind of thing. You might, if you knew about the qualities of the different products in advance, build that in by saying, you know, expressing a preference in advance for how much you preferred one good to the other. That might actually be close to a reference price auction. You, again, might use this as a guide rather than as being a final definitive decision. But as a general principle, there's a lot to be said for bringing different markets together. And if you're buying pencils of different varieties, then sure, you're already probably doing them in a single auction. And this can be a way of helping that.
We don't have the opportunity to do it in the system.
I'm sorry?
Well, so the system has to change. Yeah, so that's... Or something like that. Are there any other questions?
I'm delighted. I'm very happy to talk to you more about this. I mean, I like helping government organizations.
So we're going to have a 10 minutes break, after which Mike Schwartz, the chief economist of Microsoft, will talk about self-driving cars, car sharing, and carpooling. Thank you. 10 minutes from now.